what's interesting about that is there are all these psychological unconscious factors that play a role in, let's say if you're building an outpatient practice in your waiting room, for example, like what pictures are you putting up in your waiting room? Are you using your knowledge of priming and psychology to unconsciously like impact your patients and their desire to want to come back?
Kick it.
Welcome to Strata Stories. My name is Thomas Schreiber. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Strata PT. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. On today's episode, Paul Singh, the CEO of Strata PT, talks with Ari Ginsberg, founder of Communicatient. Paul and Ari discuss how to use behavioral psychology to improve the patient experience, enhance trust and communication with providers, and reframe healthcare practices. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo. Now, without further delay, here's today's episode.
I think the way that I would describe your business to other people is that I think the hard skills of physical therapy are pretty well covered through a lot of existing channels. Like you can go to school and learn the hard skills of physical therapy. And when I say hard skills, I mean like, I don't know, like the medicine of it and, whatever. What is not, however, covered, I think, in the industry is the soft skills of physical therapy. So how do you talk to a patient and how do you get them to buy into the care?
Yeah.
This is not unique to PT, by the way. This is like in every industry. And I think it is actually one of the biggest opportunities that nobody ever thinks about is the soft skills of every industry. So that's my like layman's terms of what I think communication is.
Not insulted at all. Definitely. I mean, I don't like the term soft skills because I think there's a science to communication, but it's definitely what you're saying is completely true. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a little bit about my background, if that's okay. And so yeah, I have three basic influences in terms of my business. The first influence was my personal story. I had a daughter, unfortunately, who passed away 13 years ago. She was 3 years old. She was my oldest child. I actually have three boys now after that who are all healthy, thank God. My oldest is 14, my next one's 11, and my youngest son is actually 8 years old. But my oldest, she had an illness and she passed away when she was 3 years old. And we had some great experiences with physicians. We knew that she was going to pass away. She had a terminal illness. We had some physicians who just made us feel like we were a part of their family. And we had other physicians who were just completely cold or just unable to communicate with us in an effective manner. So I wanted to take that, my own personal story, my own personal experience, and kind of build on that and try to teach healthcare providers how to effectively empathize and communicate with patients based on my personal story. So that's one aspect of what inspired me to start my business. Another aspect is that I love psychology. I've always loved psychology, even though I'm not a clinical psychologist. And somehow I ended up being a physical therapist. I did go back to school to get my master's degree in IO psychology, but I've always loved psychology ever since I was a kid. And I love trying to understand, the science of how we influence each other, communication. So basically, my idea was to, instead of giving a presentation where I'm trying to kind of pull on the emotions of staff, I kind of want to show the science behind it, the theory behind it, and break it down because I love educating. So I love clarifying some more complex ideas and making them simple. So that's another inspiration, my love of psychology. And then it was my own experience as a PT. I mean, majority of my career I did home health. And I remember in home health, I was always busy. I was making more money than other PTs, not because my clinical skill set was better than anybody else. My clinical skill set is fine, but it's not like exceptional. It's great. But really what differentiated me was my ability to connect with my patients, communicate with them. I had patients that, I would discharge. Then if they went back to the hospital, they would request me. So the key to being successful was more my ability to communicate and connect with patients than it was my clinical skill set. And I also know about myself that I'm more of an introvert. I actually do not like social situations. So I was able to, and also I'm a nerd like you. So I was able to break down what I was doing into kind of like a system. And that was the first course that I built. I wanted to create a continuing education course. So the first one was based on my own experiences and what I was doing that was working, what didn't work. I also showed research behind it and my whole entire system. And that's really how I started. And Actually, in the beginning, you mentioned that I started in 2019. And in the beginning, I wasn't planning on building my own business. I actually wanted to sell my course to other companies and do it for other companies. But at the time, nobody was interested in the topic. They were only interested in clinical topics. Now it's actually come full circle. And I actually did a couple of courses for MedBridge. But when I first started, I sent it out to a bunch of different companies and nobody was interested. So I just said, okay, if nobody's interested, I'm going to start building my own company and I'll start offering this as a service. So I started with that and I started building it outward and build more courses. And pretty much that's how I got started.
It's really interesting. And by the way, I appreciate the sort of the vulnerability and sharing your whole story there. I'm sorry that happened to you. You know, it's interesting coming from the tech world. We were talking in the pre-show about my background, coming from the venture side of things. I'll say a couple things. Number one, believe it or not, I'm an introvert as well. So it's kind of one of those things where like, I know it's ironic. I do this and all that, but at the same time, like we all kind of have different journeys that get us to the same outcome sometimes. And my version of it is that like I originally at some point had this realization that like I either needed to learn to figure out how to like hire salespeople and hire all these like, consultants to help me grow the business, or I was going to have to figure out, you called it the science of, and I totally agree with that, by the way. I mean, you're the one with the, the master in organizational psychology and all that. So I totally defer to you, but I kind of came at it with what I call the street MBA, which is like hard skills, whatever you want to call them. Like they're kind of like table stakes. They're not differentiated. It's like when I go to my doctor's office, I don't care where they went to school. Like the diploma on the wall means nothing to me. Maybe it does to them, and maybe it makes their mom happy. I don't know. There's a reason they do it. I can't figure it out, but it's certainly not for the patients. But the other side of it is there's a reason why I go out of my way to maybe stick to a certain primary care doctor over others. And it's not going to show up on a P&L or a balance sheet or any sort of business spreadsheet. It's this thing called likability.
Exactly.
Um, and there's this book that I really reference a lot when I think back to that big pivotal moment for me, probably 20 years ago now. It's called the Charisma Myth by Olivia Cabane. And what she basically talks about in this book is this idea that charisma is not innate to our children. It's not like they come out of the womb and one of them knows how to be the first one picked for the kickball team. That is just not how charisma works. And that it's a learnable skill. And then maybe to your point, I think you would interpret it as a science. There's a science behind it. Um, and I think,
When I give my presentations, that's exactly what I start with about how some people have like they have kind of a resistance to this topic because they feel like you can't learn it. It's almost like innate. So I speak about that and how it is a skill set and how you can break things down. And that's what I try to show them in my course. So yeah, exactly what you're saying.
yeah, I think, it's funny. And I'm going to go a little off topic for just a second. And I'm going to be at risk of becoming your in Tony Robbins or something like that. But, the thing is that like, this is one of those topics where you don't get it until it clicks. And then when it clicks, you can't unsee it. You can't put it away. Like, in other words, I remember, you know, again, I'm going a little off topic, but just to make the point, when I was getting into venture capital, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. The first thing I did is I went and I cold emailed all these other like really successful investors, and I would ask them questions that I thought you're supposed to ask, like what makes a good investor, right? Long story short, there, you know, they would all give me back some combination of what I call um, judgment, capital, and deal flow. They'd say, "Gosh, if you want to be a great investor, Paul, you got to have judgment." Well, okay, thank you, genius. Or they'd say, "You got to have access to money, capital." Like, oh, wow, mind breaking, but this is amazing. Wow, thank you. And then the third most common thing was like, "You need deal flow. Like, you need to be like in Silicon Valley." And I'm like, really? Because people like me, they're not from Silicon Valley, and not a whole lot of people are. So something's not right there. And so the conclusion I kind of came to eventually was that like it comes down to access. In other words, capital, deal flow, and judgment are table stakes. Like obviously, if you don't have good judgment, you're not going to be an investor very long. Obviously, if you don't have capital, you're not going to be a good investor very long. Those are table stakes, though, just to walk into the casino. And I came to this conclusion: if you had the table stakes, the means to walk into this proverbial casino, the difference between the one that loses all their money walking out of the casino, which in the case of venture capital is 99.9% of them, versus the one that actually runs the casino and kind of takes over and flips the house a little bit, is access. In other words, the best deals, the best opportunities in life, whether it's like that job you want, that patient you want, that business you want, or whatever, the best deals have very limited like it's not like everybody can do them. So in other words, to get access to them, you have to be likable. You got to put yourself out there. So anyway, now I'm your Indian Tony Robbins, but
No, I mean, everything you said is completely true. I agree with, and yeah, I mean, likability and familiarity and building that connection is really critical for really putting yourself above others.
maybe a conversation for another time. But like the closest thing that I ever read, like you're the first guy I've met in the PT world that talks about this way. But a big reason why it resonates with me, for example, is that probably 15, we're recording this in 2025, so 15 maybe 16 years ago, I ended up meeting a guy at Stanford University who ran their what they call their persuasive technology lab, which is if you ever get a chance, it is. It doesn't. The naming is horrible, right? But like maybe to nerds, you and I, like you and I, we love that stuff. But it is so good. Like the research behind, like even the Facebook like button, which we all take for granted. Those are things that kind of came out of the persuasive technology lab 2 decades ago.
I mean, I love that stuff. That's kind of the stuff that, I mean, there's a great book called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini. He's like a famous psychologist, social psychologist. So I kind of actually one of my courses that I give, I take the concepts of using psychological influence in order to help patients be a more adherent to their home exercise program. So one of the things he talks about is how to successfully negotiate. And when you're working with a patient, sometimes you need to negotiate. So he speaks about anchoring bias and how to use that in order to negotiate. So I speak about that in terms of home exercise programs. Like, do you try to over how many exercises do you put in your program? Maybe you should put in more and then negotiate down to show the patient that you're willing to listen to them, give them the power to choose. So I love that stuff. I love how it's basically like behavioral economics is another name for it. And yeah, what you're just talking about is I love that. I really love learning about that stuff. I have so many books on those topics. So yeah.
On the communication website somewhere, one of the things it talks about is this. You kind of have this. There's these 3 bullet points you put, and let me just run them off, and then I'll ask you the question. So it says better connect with patients, prevent burnout, and then develop enhanced emotional intelligence. Uh, that that third one kind of makes sense, right? Because like you go on to say therapists need people skills or they will not succeed. Like that makes sense to me, 100%. The first two I thought were kind of interesting. I wanted to ask a question about this because the first one seems obvious. It says better connect with patients. This increases retention, arrival rate, satisfaction, improves outcomes. That makes sense to me. But then the second bullet point is prevent burnout. This helps with staffing, employee satisfaction. So can you talk to me about that? So when you teach these therapists, psychology and these things, right? How does that prevent burnout?
Yeah, so I actually, great question. Thank you for asking. I have a presentation. Actually, it's a continuing education course that's around 2 hours, and it's all about burnout prevention from the perspective of an organization and also from the perspective of a clinician. Because I think that sometimes clinicians just blame the organization, and you're not going to get anywhere if you do that. And sometimes organizations just say it's not our fault, it's our staff's fault. So I kind of try to offer different reasons behind why a person may be burnt out. Not only do I offer those reasons in the course, but actually, when I do it with organizations, there's a couple parts to it. But during the presentation, I basically want a person to develop and understand their own reasons for burnout, what their signs of burnout are, and how they're going to address it. So I give like a list of 9 different common causes of burnout. And then as I'm going through it, I'll ask, I usually use polls and worksheets. So I'll ask, okay, of the three that I just mentioned, the first three that I just mentioned, which one do you identify with? Which one is most resonant with you? And at the end, when I speak about solutions for burnout, I do the same thing. I ask the staff, okay, of the 3 solutions, I speak about a bunch of solutions, but the first three that I just mentioned, which one are you going to try out in the next couple of weeks? And I also bring a lot of the data to the organization anonymously, of course. And it seems to be very helpful to the organization leadership because now they understand. Because I've gotten some really significant feedback from staff members. People have said that when I heard your presentation, I just started crying because I realized how burnt out I was. Like some people give really emotional responses and feedback, but then I collate all the data and bring it to their leadership team, and I show them like what people are saying and what the scores are, and how people are feeling in the organization, and then I work on a plan with the organization in order to develop ways to combat burnout. So that's pretty much what I and I also one of the things that I love to do is like, you mentioned that you like learning about new things and kind of like challenging yourself. So I love building content. So I kind of challenge myself to learn how to use a website called Animaker. So I use Animaker to create like 2D animation videos. So I do that in conjunction with my presentations. I usually offer like short micro learning videos to reinforce the concepts that I teach. And I've also delved into it's called Synthesia right now. So it's basically an avatar based, it's really cool. It's an avatar based presentation platform that I've been using to create courses. I'm also working, this is just a side piece. I'm working on a podcast, turning a podcast into a YouTube video for a friend of mine, and it's on physics. So I'm using Synthesia. It's really cool. I like breaking down the information. They're the ones with the podcast, but I have to represent it visually. So it's kind of a challenge, but I'm really enjoying working on that as well. So yeah,
All right, so let's play the other side of this. So there's probably some cynical listener or watcher on YouTube right now looking like, and they're like, they've probably made it 20 minutes into this episode and they haven't, turned it off yet, right? What do you say to them about like the benefits? So yeah, I mean, all right, we're doing this like hand wavy thing, right? You're going to make my clinicians feel better about themselves. So great, love it. Um, but uh, can you talk a little bit about sort of what success really looks like? So when you do teach these clinicians how to handle this and to understand this stuff, like what have you seen? I'm sure the answer is yes, but have you seen like demonstrable improvements on the business?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, from a business standpoint, it makes sense. Everything that I'm saying, I think, is kind of intuitive. Obviously, like if you're better at communicating with patients, then your patients are going to want to come back. They're going to be adherent to their plan of care. They're more likely to get better, but they're also more likely to want to come to their next session and come back for more visits. So you're going to reduce your cancellation rates. If your clinicians are less burnt out, they're likely not to leave your organization, and also they're going to produce, or they're going to be providing better care and better communication. There's a lot of research on the relationship between the two. And emotional intelligence is also critical for teamwork. So yeah, I've had like organizations basically reach out to me afterwards and tell me that it's been instrumental in kind of turning things around. And I've also been invited back to several organizations to do more presentations, so that's a good sign. So yeah, I mean it's going really well. Yeah, so that's the kind of the feedback that I get from
That that
organizations.
that's cool. Now something that came up in the pre-show when we were kind of thinking about topics and stuff is that you had mentioned that your most viewed course is on ethical decision making, which having getting to know you, I'm like, that is not what I thought the most viewed course would be. I thought it'd be like, I don't know, bedside manner or something. I don't know. But can you talk a little bit about that? Why is it the ethics course that is the most viewed?
First of all, practically ethics is like one of the requirements in certain states. Aside from that, um, I do have a background. I like ethics. I do have a religious background as well. But aside from my religious background, the course it's really an interesting course. I thought it was going to be kind of dry. I was nervous about creating an ethics course, but I found a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. It's by a social psychologist. His name is Jonathan Haidt. He's pretty well known. And basically, he talks about the psychology of moral decision making. So, in this course, I take the APTA Code of Ethics and the AOTA Code of Ethics, and I demonstrate that there are a lot of gray situations where we kind of plug in the gaps with our intuition, and then we can rationalize why we made our decision. And sometimes we have, or often, there are two ways to go in terms of how to rationalize it. So in my course, I present like gray situations that I encountered. And then I ask the audience participants, okay, what is right and what is wrong in this situation? And I show them two sides and how you can view it from two perspectives and it's not so clear cut. So yeah, I get a lot of amazing feedback on the course. I love giving it. I thought it wasn't going to be so much fun giving it, but it happens to be definitely most viewed course. And I actually love giving the course because I get a lot of participation. I ask like poll questions throughout, just getting audience participation, and people get really heated about this stuff. So yeah, it's fun.
They do. And again, because I've never been a PT. I've never been a PT, so I don't know. Like, what do they get so heated about?
So one question is like, are you allowed to? So here's a classic ethics question that's not as clear as you might think in the APTA Code of Ethics. Let's say a patient offers you a tip on the last visit. Are you allowed to accept the money or not? Okay, so some people are like, no, I won't accept any money from patients. And then I follow up, will you accept food from a patient? Like, let's say a patient brings in cookies. Would you accept that from a patient? So a lot of PTs will say, yes, they will accept food. Then I ask, okay, what's the difference between money and food? How do you justify it rationally? How does it fit into the ethics system? So then I go through different ways of looking at it, but I ultimately demonstrate that there's a lot of intuition when it comes to these factors, and people do get heated about this stuff. Or
Huh.
I also try to demonstrate that everybody. Here's a good example. Like I try to demonstrate that everybody's a little bit unethical to some degree. So the example that I use is speeding. So I ask the audience members, like, do you ever speed? And almost everybody says yes. There's always like, if I have a huge course, there's always like one person that says I never speed. I doubt that, but I ask you, do you speed? And then people say yes. And they ask, okay, like, when do you slow down? And like, what's the number that you've chosen? So people usually come up with a number like 10 miles over. Then I slow down and then I ask for rationalization. Like, why did you pick that number? So people say I go with the flow of traffic, or I'm a safe driver, or cops won't pull me over. So I try to demonstrate from that example that we're all unethical. Why? Because ultimately the goal of a speed limit is to protect society, because people aren't as safe as drivers when they drive over the speed limit. It also lessens the injuries, that you cause. But yet, so if you really cared about society, which is an ethical good, you would never speed. But we have this gut sense, we have this intuition that it's okay, either because like other people are doing it, or we just feel like it's okay to do. And then we rationalize after the fact, oh, because cops don't pull you over, so it must not be so bad, or I'm a really good speeder. So we rationalize, sorry, not speeder, I'm a really good driver. So we rationalize after the fact as to why it's okay to do so. So
Right.
we're all like somewhat. Then I ask them the question, like, I'm not like endorsing this, but I'll ask, okay, let's say you saw a colleague that was cutting like a minute or two off a visit, but they were billing for that 2 minutes. Like, let's say a colleague was billing for a 30-minute visit, if that's how your billing system worked, but they were only doing 29 minutes or 28 minutes. Would you speak to them about it? Would you report them? So I don't give an answer, because obviously, if you were like 100% ethical, you would say, of course, I'll report them if they do 29-minute visits and they're billing for 30-minute visits. But I think there's this intuition like speeding that, no, like if it's 2 minutes, it's not such a big deal. If it's 3 minutes, it's not just a big deal. I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that we all have like gray aspects. So my ethics course is basically just exploring our grays when it comes to ethical decision making, where they are, and how we rationalize and justify different decision making processes.
That's super fascinating. What about okay, so then maybe in a related vein, obviously you've got these continuing education courses, and obviously they're probably very thorough. So I'm not going to do any justice by asking simple questions, but just for the sake of the audience, when you think about for example, like in one of the notes I had here, it was like, there's a course that you've got for increasing patients' buy-in to complete their home exercise program. Obviously, it's a long course. We can't possibly cover it in a few minutes here, but can you give an example of, one or two of the tactics that somebody might learn in a course like that? Like, again, if somebody's listening to this and watching this far in, they're kind of bought in. Now I love to kind of like go into some maybe examples that are tactical. Like what are like maybe one or two examples in that program, for example, that people could get an idea of what it's like.
Okay, so here's two examples just from that course alone. One of them is based on what you mentioned earlier. Like, why do doctors have their diploma on the wall? Like, is there a benefit in terms of the patient? So ultimately, if you don't like a doctor, you're not going to go back to them, of course. But the purpose of a diploma on a wall is that it projects authority. And authority functions as an influence. Like, if you watch a commercial and on the commercial, they're talking about a pharmaceutical product, and you have a person who has like the white coat, and they have like doctor. Why do they put those people in the commercials? Because there's a realization, there's a knowledge that when you come off as an authority, it may influence a person to a greater degree than if you don't come off as an authority. So something as slight as just keeping your diploma on the wall, or as PTs, we love to debate this, but calling yourself doctor, that's a big debate in the PT world. I spoke to Dr. Mabry, Lance Mabry, about this, and I might be like hopefully like working with him on an ethics paper regarding this. But ultimately, when you come off as a doctor, you come off as more of an authority figure. So it does have an influence as to whether or not a patient may listen to you in terms of your recommendations. So promoting your authority and showing that you are an expert in the field is like a psychological tactic. It's very basic. But another strategy that you can use is like commitments. So people are more likely to follow through when they commit to something verbally or in writing. So if you're working with a patient and you want them to commit to their home exercise program, having them sign, let's say, a fake, it doesn't have to be a real contract, but having them sign a contract that they're going to do their part, that they're going to follow their program, is something that you can do in order to increase the likelihood of them following their home exercise program. So commitment is another way, or just one last strategy, consistency. Like people want to live up to their to how they view themselves in the eyes of others. So like let's say somebody wants to come off as wealthy and you go out to a meal with them, they're going to pick up the check. They might not want to pick up the check, but they'll do it because they want other people to look at them in a certain way, to see them as being wealthy. So when you say to a patient something like, you seem very motivated, you seem like a motivated person. So when you say that, you're building this image. And now a may have this desire to be consistent with that image. So that just increases the likelihood of adherence to their exercise plan. So those are just three strategies, but a lot of them are based on, as I mentioned before, the book Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. That's a marketing book. I take the marketing concepts and I apply them for healthcare practitioners, to increase compliance. Yeah.
The thing about it is that, and I think you would agree with me on this. When you start to learn more about these techniques, it's hard to then unsee them happening all around you in all these different industries. Like, in other words, we're not talking about, I'm going to say this, with all the respect in the world, what you're talking about is core human behavior, the things that make us like we all want to believe that we make rational choices, but at the end of the day, it's mostly our lizard brain that has evolved over time that has said, "Oh, if I do it this way, I usually don't get hurt, and I sometimes get more money if I do it that way." Like you just sort of, but then you start to realize, like, oh, that's the reason why. For example, when you're buying a car, sometimes these places will be like, "Okay, so if I get you that price, are you in?" And they'll get you to sign this thing, which is clearly not a contract, but they still try to get you to sign this blank piece of paper, and it really is just showing you commit, or that in your mind that you've committed to this thing, which is probably not the best example, but
Yeah, like I mentioned anchoring bias a little bit, but just anchoring bias, like a good example of that is, let's say somebody wants to sell you a television for $500. So there are two tactics that a person can use. One is they could just say this television is $500, or they can show you a television that's $1,000 first, then show you the $500 one. So when you see the $500 one after the $1,000 one, your mind is anchored on the price $1,000, and you think you're getting a deal when you buy the $500 one. However, ultimately, that's what you wanted to sell it for in the first place. So it's like by the way, everybody does this. All marketers and all companies use anchoring bias in order to sell. So if you're trying to sell to a patient, but not from a personal gain standpoint, but you want to sell them because you want them to buy into their home exercise program, you need to know how to negotiate with your patients and you need to understand anchoring bias.
It's not to go off topic on this. I was thinking about, we were actually just talking about a similar topic on this internally yesterday. And the example I used was, uh, 1-800 contacts. So I order my contact lenses online, and one of the examples I used with our team internally was I showed them I pulled up on my screen share my text messages from this company over the last 8 weeks. And what was interesting was, as it got closer to the end of the year, their text messages, their messages don't say, "Buy more contacts, Paul." I mean, I guess if they were lazy, that's what they would do and whatever. But instead, it was tied to this idea of like, they were like, "Hey, Paul, you have 40." I'm making this up, but just off the top of my head, it was like, "Hey, Paul, you have $387 of benefits left in your FSA or your HSA. Don't forget to use it, before the end of the year. Like, you'll lose it if you don't." And all the language was really built around the way I explained it to my team is like, it made me feel like, or realize that very few of us would walk past $100 bill just sitting on a sidewalk. And
Right.
yet we will flippantly not show up to the doctor for whatever reason, maybe, and we'll justify it to ourselves. "Oh, God, that meeting ran long, so I just couldn't make it to the appointment. Listen, it's not a big deal, Ari. I know we got 6 visits. Let's just get it done in 5. It's no big deal. But we justify it to ourselves. But if we realize that, I don't know, there's something to this idea that we talked about this internally, this idea that what if our own messaging as a product helps patients um, recognize how much they're leaving on the table, how much they're not getting the benefit out of their insurance company, and stuff like that, which, by the way, I feel like I
You may
now
have
have to
heard
take
about
your
this,
ethics.
but it's actually called something when you're describing, it's called loss aversion bias. So it's like yeah. Like the classic example, I mean, that I know of loss aversion is from like Dan Ariely, who I think is a great social psychologist. And he gives an example. The example is that he used to teach at MIT and he put a table out with two different types of chocolates. One of them were Lindt chocolates and the other one were Hershey Kisses. The Lindt chocolates he was selling for 15 cents a chocolate, and the Hershey Kisses he was selling for 1 cent a chocolate. And he found that more of the students chose the Lindt chocolates because they were better in terms of quality and they're just better chocolates. But then all he did was remove or at least lessen it by 1 cent. So now the Hershey Kisses were free, but the Lindt chocolates were 14 cents. And rationally, people should still buy the Lindt chocolates more than the Hershey Kisses because if you're willing to pay 15 cents, certainly you should be willing to pay 14 cents. But they found the opposite, that when something was free, the Hershey Kisses, a lot more people went to the Hershey Kisses. A lot of people are afraid, or there's an irrational fear of loss, of losing money. That's why people make mistakes when they invest in the market. Fear of loss. You're not supposed to freak out when the market is tanking, but a lot of people make those mistakes because of loss aversion bias. Yeah.
Right, right, right. I think on that topic, Warren Buffett, or maybe it was his business partner, one of them once said that, like, somebody asked him a question, what's the hardest thing about investing? And he said, sitting around and doing nothing. That's the hardest thing. And the analyst is like, what do you mean? And he goes, well, look, he said something like, any idiot can put money to work, or he said something like, almost any idiot can put money to work. The real geniuses have figured out how to just sit around and do nothing because that's all you got to do, which is so counterintuitive to what we believe.
Dan Ariely, I think, mentioned like locking himself out of his phone when the markets are going down so he can't do anything. Meaning, like, you have to create situations that prevent you from acting irrationally. So sometimes you got to kind of force yourself to not make that dumb decision. Yeah.
This is going to be, I think, maybe a difficult question, and you can totally take a pass on it. But one of the other guys that we've had on the show pretty regularly is a guy named Jerry Durham, and really interesting guy, really interesting character. But one of the things that he said to me, he said it so casually to me years or months ago, and I still think about it a lot. The question I asked him was, I said, so his business, he does a lot of consulting on the front desk experience practices, and so I asked him this question of, hey, Jerry, you've been doing this a long time, what have you found to be the best way to get the pulse of a practice and to kind of find maybe the low hanging fruit before you even get in there? And he, didn't even hesitate. He said, "Oh, I just sit, in the waiting room and I hang out for an hour or two." And I was like, and now it makes sense to me. At the time, I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "Well, there's nothing like just sitting in the waiting room and watching a patient come in and just see how their interaction goes. Like, did they get greeted? Did they not? Did they get shoved to the back to their chair with a clipboard? Did they not?" So maybe I'll ask you the same kind of question. Like, you've been doing this for a long time now. You've met a ton of clinicians, probably a lot of practice owners. Um, I gather that most of what you're doing is remote, but still, the question still stands. You know, if you and I were to, like, maybe go hang out at a practice and they just didn't know we existed, you know, what do you think some of the most common mistakes are that we would see clinicians make? Um, and again, it's probably like such a simple question because you see it all the time, but I'm kind of curious, like, what are the most common?
Great question. First of all, I know Jerry, and I've done a couple of tapings with Jerry too. So, like, I do know Jerry, and I've spoken to him a bunch. So, yeah, he's a great resource. No, I mean, some of the mistakes that patients make are that, first of all, if they ever get into like a fight with the patient, or let's say the patient's aggressive, they can't keep their cool. They don't understand like the importance of like validation. That's a key. Like when a patient is really frustrated, validating their opinion and not just fighting with them angrily is really key, and that's a big error that people make. Not a lack of empathy and support is also something that's really a lack. Like if you're not saying to your patients, I'm here to support you, if you need anything you can always get in touch with me. So those are things that are obvious, and just first impressions are really important. Like if you well, one thing that Dale Carnegie speaks about is mentioning a person's name, like Paul. The name Paul, when you're speaking to a person, means that you remember them, you value them. So, like, if you're looking at your tablet when you first meet a patient and you don't know their name, you're not like prepared. It shows a lack of preparedness with the patient. You don't know their name. You're not addressing them in a polite, manner, like saying Mr. or Mrs. So those are some mistakes. You just want to, because there's something called the halo effect bias, which is basically the power of first impressions. So I would say like first impressions and making a positive first impression is really, really important. Also, the way you dress, like if you see a clinician who's wearing like a tank, not that this happens all the time, but if you see a clinician that's not dressed professionally, it impacts the way the patient views them as an authority, and it becomes harder to make that up in future visits. So those are just
Yeah.
some examples, but ultimately the numbers don't lie. Like if a patient, if a clinician's getting poor scores, poor patient satisfaction scores, that's just a sign that there needs to be improvement. And there's always improvement that could be made with amongst communication skills.
It's interesting. Now that I think about it, and maybe this is something we should think about in our products, but I'm curious, does this exist? Like, when you, and I'm making this up, but when I take my car in for an oil change at Chevy, the last thing the sales or the service rep says to me is like, "Hey, listen, if something wasn't great today, you got to let me know because tomorrow you're going to get a survey and I'd really like to make sure I get 5 stars on it." Like, we could argue all day whether or not that's a good thing or bad thing, but the point is that there's clearly a system in place of third party checks and balances to make sure the experience is good. Um, Now that I think about it, though, I'm not sure I've ever experienced something similar in the healthcare world.
Well, you're not allowed certain like in the hospital systems and home health, you're not allowed to talk about. There's a survey that goes out from the hospital system, so you're not allowed to talk about the surveys or tip a patient off. But ultimately, like the best, what you're saying is like a system to end your visits. That every time at the end of your visit, you should end it with, thank you so much, you did a great job, and if you need anything, please don't hesitate to call me or call my office. So if you can end your visit in a consistent manner and have all your clinicians end their visits that way, has a huge impact. It's just so simple, but it has a huge impact. Um, so, yeah, it's like basically creating a system whereby it's like design process thinking, where you create a system of this is how I want you to open with your patients, this is how I want you to close with your patients, and here are some concepts that you can utilize in order to enhance the middle of the visit as well. So yeah,
This is going to sound like a bad joke, and it probably is, but it's kind of like I wonder sometimes what the modern day physical therapy practice would look like if it was designed and engineered from a psychological standpoint by somebody from Chick-fil-A. Uh, because like what you're talking about, again, I say this like I know it's a bad joke, but once I'll stand by this. I said it earlier. Once you really start to understand, or at least like be open to these ideas, it becomes hard to not see them happening around you in some of the most successful businesses. And so I think about Chick-fil-A, even like a very minor thing, like they always end their order taking process with "my pleasure." Now, I was talking about this topic with one of my other team members this morning, and we got onto the topic of ROI, and then he was like, "Well, I think we should do that, but I don't know how we're going to get any ROI or measure it." And I was like, "Look, sometimes you can't measure the ROI, but the fact is a human being on the other end can tell the difference between something you put care into versus something you didn't." And so like for example, that "my pleasure" thing is unique, and it's one of those things where on its own it's probably useless. Like on its own, if that's the only thing people do as a business owner, it will make zero impact to the business. But I have a feeling like if there's enough attention to detail put such that like every employee always ends with that, it tells me as a customer that every other part of the business they have also has a high degree of care. Like I got to imagine the kitchen's like I've never been inside the kitchen of a Chick-fil-A, but I imagine it's like 10x cleaner than a McDonald's. I imagine that the quality it may not be. It may be exactly the same. I don't know, but what I feel, the perception is often what really is the goal here. And it's the reason why I'm willing to spend $7 on a chicken sandwich that I could spend 2 instead of $2 at a competitor.
I mean, most successful businesses have a psychological design behind them. Like the classic is IKEA, like how they design their stores. So you have to basically walk through their stores and see all of their products. Basically, the point of that is so that people buy their stuff, but they design their stores in a way with a psychology in mind, in a way to kind of, I guess, sell their product. So there's a
Yeah.
concept. I mean, one of the concepts I speak about, I hope I'm not like going on too much about it, but one of the concepts is called priming. So priming is also a psychology concept. There's a famous, well-known psychologist at Yale. His name is John Barr, and he speaks about some of the experiments he's done. It's a really cool experiment. You can find it on YouTube as well. In one experiment, he has a researcher in an elevator, and they're standing next to the subject, the person in the study, and the researcher just says, "Can you hold on to this drink for a minute?" And the drink's a cold drink. And then afterwards, they meet a person, and that person just interviews them, and then they ask the person who was holding the drink, what did you think about the person who was interviewing you? And they found a difference between those who held cold drinks and warm drinks, that if you just hold a warm drink, it makes you, or it conjures up the idea of warmth, so it makes you think about the next person that you meet in a warm fashion, even though it's the same person. And these people had no idea that that was the purpose of the experiment. Whereas the people who had the cold drink just for a minute or two right before meeting that next person had an idea that that person's a cold person. So, what's interesting about that is there are all these psychological unconscious factors that play a role in, let's say if you're building an outpatient practice in your waiting room, for example, like what pictures are you putting up in your waiting room? Are you using your knowledge of priming and psychology to unconsciously like impact your patients and their desire to want to come back? Like, are you putting up pictures of people that are healthy, people that are running? That's just one example. So there's just a lot of research behind it. But you're right, like physical therapy practices and all healthcare practices need to incorporate psychology, in order to enhance their outcomes.
Yeah, that's really interesting, man. I think that, and this is going to sound so basic, right? That maybe to you, but it's something I've been saying over and over internally to our product teams, but also to a lot of our clients when I meet with them one on one. I make this statement that like, you know, it's like this question veiled as a statement, and I say like, look, what if you started to think about your healthcare practice as a patient acquisition and retention company that happens to be in the healthcare space? And how would you think how would that if you started to embrace this idea that I know is poorly articulated, but how would the decisions you make day to day in terms of what that front desk experience looks like, what the in clinic experience looks like, how would those things change if you looked at it that way instead of, hey, look, I'm just a healthcare provider. Hey, hey, I'm just here to kind of like make you feel better. Like, and when you really start getting people to think that way, you can start to see the light bulb turn on in their mind. And I think
It's
it's
just
just
hard to change people. Like you're mentioning a really important point. Like a lot of people have this like negative resentment towards the word like salesman. Like if you say, "Oh, here are some sales techniques for you as the healthcare provider," even though like everybody's selling all the time, and you're always using techniques to sell like your concepts, your ideas to people. But when you use that term, like a lot of healthcare providers like feel like it's a dirty term or it's a dirty idea to think of it as a business, but it's not true. I mean, everybody's using salesmen, whether they might not be conscious of the fact that they're using these techniques, but everybody's using these techniques when they communicate and when they interact. I just try to bring I just try to bring it to light as to what's going on. What is happening here? Why is this working? Why is this not working? That's just my job.
right. I love it, man. I love it. Man, I could talk about this topic forever. Um, we're gonna have to get you back on the show, but so obviously, when we publish this, we're gonna put a link to communication on the website or on the episode, so people can go find them. But if people are watching this and they want to come find you, what's the best way for them to get in touch? Is it LinkedIn? Is it email?
Yeah, LinkedIn is great. Like I post relatively frequently, and thankfully I have a nice following now. So LinkedIn is great for sure. And I just started a YouTube page not that long ago, so I do put up some free stuff, obviously on YouTube. And you can also send me an email. Just it's a.ginsberg@communicatient.com. So if you're interested in anything that I do, definitely would love to speak with you.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Strata Stories. Strata PT combines your EMR and billing into one automated system to increase revenue and achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate for physical, occupational, and speech therapy clinics. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how our EMR and billing services work, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.